On a fur farm in Siberia, there are two kinds of fox. Reach toward the first and it slams into the bars, snarling, trying to tear your hand open. Reach toward the second and it whimpers, rolls over, and pushes its head into your palm to be petted. Same animal. Same farm, born a few cages apart. The only thing separating them is an experiment that has run for 60 years. Nobody trained the gentle ones. Nobody tamed them. Their grandparents were wild animals that would have run from you. These foxes were born running toward you instead. That experiment proved something no one thought was possible. You can take a wild predator and, in less than a human lifetime, rebuild it into an animal that loves people. And this is the reason dogs love humans. It's not necessarily loyalty or gratitude. Yes, a dog's love is real, but it was never the point. It came bundled with something else entirely, and that is the strangest part of all. Now, dogs came from wolves, not foxes, but you cannot run the experiment on wolves. They breed too slowly and they are far too dangerous. So the fox was used instead, a wild cousin of the dog that has a new litter every year, the silver fox. The man who ran the experiment was a Soviet biologist named Dmitri Belyaev, and when he started it in 1959, the Soviet Union had banned genetics itself. Stalin's government called it a Western lie, and the men who studied it were fired, jailed, and even killed. Belyaev kept working anyway, quietly, because he was convinced he understood something no one had ever proven. He believed that every domestic animal we have, the dog, the cow, the pig, was made by accident, that nobody ever sat down and designed a dog. That domestication was the result of selecting for a single trait over and over and letting everything else follow on its own. To prove it, he went to the fur farms of Siberia, where silver foxes were raised by the thousand for their pelts. Walked down the row and they hurl themselves at the back of the cage, snapping, ears flat. Belyaev's team gave each fox a test. They would open each cage and reach for the animal, scoring how it reacted, from the ones that lunged to bite, down to the rare few that held still. Out of every 100 foxes, they bred only the calmest dozen and ignored the rest. The next year, they tested that new generation and again kept only the gentlest few. They selected for one quality. They only cared about how calm the foxes actually were. For the first few generations, nothing happened. The foxes stayed wild. Then it began, and it did not stop. Within a few generations, the first fox wagged its tail at a researcher. By the sixth, there were foxes that licked at hands and cried when their favorite person walked away. Belyaev was breeding for calm, and what kept coming out the other side was affection. Then the body started to change. The fox's ears, normally stiff and pointed, began to flop. Their straight tails curled up into a loose hook. Patches of white spread across their fur, almost always beginning as a single star on the forehead. Their snouts shortened and their skulls rounded out, until they had the soft, open face of a puppy. Belyaev had selected for none of it. He picked the friendly ones, and the floppy ears and the spotted coats arrived anyway. Generation after generation, and the changes ran deeper than anything you could see. By the 12th generation, the tame foxes carried half the stress hormones in their blood that a normal fox did. By around the 30th, that level had halved again. Their brains were making more serotonin, the chemical that keeps an animal calm and content. Normally, fox pups hit an age where they suddenly start fearing anything new. In the tame foxes, that fear was switching on weeks later, leaving them open and trusting for longer. Their breeding seasons stretched. Their entire body chemistry was being rewritten, on its own, by the single act of choosing the friendly ones. By the time 40 years had passed, the team had raised 45,000 foxes across more than 30 generations. Belyaev never saw it finished. He died in 1985, and his colleague Lyudmila Trut carried the work on. Today, the tamest foxes are born this way, seeking out people, no taming required. The reason all of it came bundled together sits in the very first days of life, before the fox is even born. It comes down to one batch of cells. These cells, called the neural crest, fan out through the body and build a handful of things that seem totally unrelated. The color in the fur, the stiffness of the ears, the shape of the snout, and the glands that trigger fear. They all come from that same batch. So when you change one, you quietly change the rest. That is exactly what Belyaev was doing. Year after year, breeding only the calmest foxes, he shrank that batch of cells. Fewer of them meant less fear, which is what he wanted, but it also meant less color in the coat, softer ears, and a rounder, more puppy-like face. He pulled one lever, and a dozen things moved at once. Fear and cuteness are wired to the same dial. You cannot turn one down without turning the other. It is why almost every animal we have ever tamed, foxes and dogs and even pigs, drifts toward the same floppy-eared, soft-faced, patchy-coated look. Scientists named the pattern the domestication syndrome, and Belyaev had triggered the whole of it on purpose, just by choosing the gentle ones. We have always told the story of domestication with ourselves in charge. We captured wild animals and tamed them, bred them, bent them to our will. Belyaev proved it does not work that way. You do not design a dog. You select for one thing, friendliness, and the animal redesigns itself. The body, the face, the chemistry, the calm, all of it pours out of that single choice. And the love is inside that package. The devotion, the way it looks at you and melts, was never the goal of domestication. It is a side effect of breeding the fear out of a wild thing, which means we have had the story of dogs backward for our entire history. Belyaev did this to foxes on purpose. In 60 years, the very same thing happened to wolves on its own, but that took more than 15,000 years. Wolves that were a little less afraid crept closer to human camps, ate better, bred more, and passed on their calm. No one tamed the first dog. The friendliest wolves bred the fear out of themselves and turned into dogs, the same way the foxes did, only slower, with no one watching. And every strange thing in those foxes is sitting in the animal on your floor right now. When a dog and its owner gaze into each other's eyes, both their brains release oxytocin, the same hormone that floods a parent holding their newborn. Your dog reaches into the chemistry your body keeps for your own children and switches it on. Dogs even grew a new muscle for it, a small one above the eye that wolves essentially lack, whose only job is to lift the inner brow into the pleading look you have never been able to resist. It is the face that gets a shelter dog adopted faster, and if you have never owned a dog, you have still fallen for it, from a friend's or a stranger's on the street, and it runs all the way down into the genes. The friendliest dogs carry changes in the very same stretch of DNA that, when it is missing in a human being, causes Williams syndrome, a condition that leaves people trusting on sight and loving almost without fear. Your dog's devotion is written in the canine version of that same code. We have been doing this to each other a very long time. In a grave in Oberkassel, Germany, 2 people were buried with a dog laid carefully between them. That dog died as a puppy from a disease called distemper that normally kills within weeks. It only lived as long as it did because someone fed it by hand and kept it warm through the worst of the sickness, when it was far too sick to even stand. And when it died, they buried it pressed against their own bodies. 14,000 years ago, before farming and before writing, a person loved a dying puppy that could do nothing for them in return, enough to carry it into the grave. So look at your dog tonight and understand what you are actually looking at. It did not choose to love you. Neither did the foxes in Siberia. The choice was made for them, generation by generation, by the calmest animals that ever lived, long before any of them were born. Your dog inherited the result, the floppy ears and the soft eyes and the helpless, total devotion, all of it grown out of one ancient act of selecting against fear. It was built to love you, by forces it never knew, before it ever drew breath. And when it crosses the room and lays its head in your lap, none of that makes the love any less real. It only makes it older and stranger than you ever thought.